Okay, I'm here to walk you through a few things this week. We will just start with the view from here, the homepage. I would advise that collapsing all is a good way to make sure that you're seeing everything that you need to see. This one will be published for you by class time, hopefully beforehand. And I'm just going to click into it now just to show you and talk through it a bit. And so, yeah, I'm at a conference and during our live scheduled time. So I wanted to make sure that I did you justice and did the right thing for you. So we've got a lot of preparation here going into this week on my part, and I hope on yours. And I updated our notes page. Make sure that you have the, this is kind of a minimum, a starting point, that you've got these notes recorded in your notebook. And I want to recommend that you're keeping a handwritten notebook as opposed to just like a copy and paste kind of notebook. If you're typing things, the neuropsych research suggests that it is not doing as much good. I mean, like even close to as much good as if you're handwriting things. When you handwrite, things are slowed down a bit and they tend to code into your mind a lot better than if you're just reading something, especially if you're reading silently. Reading aloud is a good approach as well to be paired with your handwritten notebook. But I wanted to make sure that you know that this page is updated. The second thing was definitely to check that you're done with your assignments for that have been due here. So we had a group of assignments due on October 9th. I've gotten many, but not all of these assignments. I want to make sure that I draw your attention to this as a basic requirement of the course. The October 30th, which is this Friday, this coming Friday, is due. We want to make sure that you're identifying a view and then responding to it. Take your time to review the requirements before, during, and after the time when you're working on these assignments, and be ready to revise. I've been giving everybody detailed feedback, and then involved in that feedback is not just a criticism, but a constructive criticism designed to help you to improve what you're doing. And remember, the goal here is to improve our skills, not to check boxes. So with that in mind, the next thing I wanted to mention is to review the readings for today. If you read them earlier this week, skim them again. Take your time with highlighting and annotating so that you're getting as much out of it as you can. The full version of this paper I posted here. You don't have to read the full version, but if you do, you're going to be in a better position to have a full perspective, especially if you use this as a view that you want to respond to. And remember, when you do respond to a philosopher's view, you're targeting like a paragraph. We're talking about the skill that we're building on from the last group of assignments that had you really narrowed down to just one conclusion and its premises. And remember that the week 2 videos had a discussion of what an argument is and how to create and how to break an argument. And that is what we're applying here. So I advise that you go back and review the week 2 video on that topic. That is in the modules week 2. So track 2 students, we've got a discussion forum this week, and you can just click on that to get to the instructions. There's a video walkthrough there. And then I want everybody to be taking the situationism comprehension check. This page will look a little different because the video that I'm working on now will pop up underneath this. The comprehension check is just, it is a mastery. If we're talking about grading categories, it's a mastery level quiz. And the purpose of it is just to check that you understand the views that we read about in this week's first of 2 readings. And there is no time limit. You can do multiple attempts. The important thing is that you are working through it carefully and gaining understanding. If you just kind of blast through it and take it 8 times so you get all correct answers, yeah, you will have the correct answers, but your level of understanding probably isn't there. So if you get something that doesn't make sense, look back at the Doris paper to make sure you nail down exactly what's going on. Feel free to email me with questions about interpretation. Now, I wanted to walk through these papers, and you're welcome to join me for that, or you can skip forward. Here we go. And just to start out, John Doris of UC Santa Cruz is writing in response to what he calls neo-Aristotelianism. And I want to quickly just give a brief working definition. It's not a would say it's like not something I read in a textbook, but just so that we understand what we're dealing with. Doris is responding to the idea that building on Aristotle's views that we've already read about, and you know about the importance of character and habituation in Aristotle, there are modern Aristotelians or modern scholars who read Aristotle and then they talk about how people in reality, in our modern day reality, can habituate themselves toward doing the right things such that they develop a good character. And a good character means you have consistent behavior, responding in ways that others would recognize as morally correct, and that you do so probably without too much worry or thought because you have kind of changed your perspective on the world to perceive the correct thing to do and find that it's somewhat easy to do that because of your habituation. And then you do that again consistently across circumstances. So, what Doors does is it engages in something we call experimental philosophy, that is, applying experimental psychology and other experiments to try to evaluate whether or not philosophy has it right in a certain way. And in this case, we're talking about moral philosophy or ethics. And the thing that is being tested in this initial setup, which is a cool story, and there are lots of them just like it, repeated over and over again. The point here is that um, the behavioral reliability that we would expect of what we traditionally think of as a person's character doesn't exist. That it is not revealed in the systematic observation of behavior, meaning that we would expect somebody to have a character of a certain sort, either better or worse, and then they would respond the same way to lots of different situations, and they would respond in ways that we consider to be good or bad to lots of situations, irrespective of the particulars of the circumstance. However, what we have found in these experiments over and over again is that people don't respond in any kind of a consistent way, and that their circumstances appear to have a lot more to do with what they actually do in their behavior than their moral commitments. And so that's why it's set up here that the people who found a dime before they were in a situation where they could help or not help somebody, whether or not they found a dime seemed to be the determining factor. And this isn't just a one-off, not just a bad experiment. And there might be reasons to think this isn't a great experiment. Of course, it's a small sample size. It's just a kind of random test to demonstrate proof of concept, not necessarily to make the proof that everybody is always like this. However, it's repeated often enough in lots of other circumstances where situationists have come to an understanding of, and psychologists have come to an understanding of human behavior that suggests that the thing this story suggests is probably accurate. That there's another, I'll share one other story, that there were some theological seminary students in training, and they were told, they were in one building and across the street was the church, and they were told in the one building, in a few minutes you're going to be giving a sermon on the story of the Good Samaritan, somebody who's helping somebody who needs help on the side of the road. And we would expect that these theological seminaries would have good moral character, right? And the story goes that they were told, they would be preparing in that room, and then someone would pop their head into the room and say, "Hey, you have 10 minutes to get across the street to do your sermon now that you're prepared." Or they would pop their head in and say, "Hey, you're going to be right on time if you leave right now. Let's get over there." Or they would be told, "Hey, you're 10 minutes late. Get over there. You've got to deliver the sermon right away." And then as they were crossing the street, an actor was put in their way, and the actor would be stumbling or need some help. And these seminarians would either help or not help. And you might not be surprised after reading this article and hearing my setup that the people who were most likely to help were the people who were on time or early, and the people who were late, actually what they found was about half of them that were on time would help and half of them wouldn't stop to help. And most of them, if they were early, or all of them if they were early, would stop to help, and almost none of them would stop to help if they were running late. There were also kind of similar studies about whether or not a person would help somebody in need outside of a bakery with sweet smells versus a neutral smelling store with not a lot of smells. And the people who were in a circumstance where they were smelling nice smells were much more likely to help someone in need than the people who were not smelling nice smells. And it's this kind of a sequence of repetitive studies that has caused people like Doris to doubt that there is such a thing as Aristotelian character to be developed at all. And so we're just going to work through this a little bit. And he wants to suggest, this is the thesis, that situationist research has revisionary implications for ethical thought, that we should make some changes. And the idea that uh, Aristotelian approaches presuppose commitments of descriptives in descriptive psychology, meaning psychological claims that are claims about how we actually are, as opposed to normative claims about how we ought to be, and that there are commitments in descriptive psychology that once we discover what people are actually capable of, it would actually damage the Aristotelian view. The empirical criticisms will be damaging to the Aristotelian view. And the Aristotelian view, again, says that people have to have the kinds of uh, behavioral tendencies that are consistent across circumstance. And if it turns out they don't, then that's a problem for Aristotelian psychology. And that in ethical theory, um, this is okay, so here we go. This much skepticism is certainly reasonable. So, this is what we are being skeptical about, that we would to show that an ethical theory is descriptively inadequate is not the same as saying that it's normatively inadequate. Um, and the idea here is that prospects of Aristotelian normative theory are still undecided, but we need to be very careful in proceeding in Aristotelian normative theory, meaning what you ought to do on an Aristotelian view. That maybe we get to keep some of it, but we have to be extremely cautious if it turns out that people don't have characters or character. After considering empirical difficulties, in sections 2 or 3, I consider how the competing moral psychologies fare on normal grounds. And actually, we don't get very far because we don't have the entire article. The only thing assigned here is the first 7 pages. The entire article, as I suggested earlier, is available on our site if you want to read that. So we believe this is kind of the setting up of the view that Doris is going to attack or revise. We believe that the person of good character is not easily swayed by circumstances, and we have all these words that we apply to them. Conversely, when somebody disappoints, we have terms of abuse that we talk about that we use to mean lack of character. And apparently, character is expected to have a regular behavioral manifestation, that we should behave the same way across circumstances. Unfortunately for this view, experimental evidence just mentioned suggests that the approach is inadequate to the facts of actual behavior. Trait attribution, and this is why I put attribution errors in our notes. Trait attribution is often surprisingly inefficacious in predicting behavior in particular novel situations. So what we would normally attribute to somebody's character traits seems to have no relationship or very little relationship to what they actually do when we make predictions about their behavior in these situations, because differing behavioral outcomes often seem a function of situational variation more than individual disposition. This is kind of the critical thing, so I double highlighted it, that differing behavioral outcomes, meaning what people actually do, they seem a function of, meaning they are caused by, in some sense, or affected strongly by, situational variation, the circumstances, more than individual disposition. That means more than my tendency toward telling the truth. The circumstances of is it easy or hard to tell the truth are more likely to predict whether or not I'm going to tell the truth. So more than my commitment to it, my circumstances. To put things crudely, people typically lack character. And that's a nice, simple way of putting it, that we don't actually have character and it's important that if we were going to say dispute this, that we know what Doris means by the word character. He is pointing specifically to what Aristotle thought of as good character, that there's firm and unchangeable tendencies, a disposition, and it is like a permanent disposition that is hard to change. And virtues are supposed to have reliable behavioral manifestations. Like we might suffer misfortunes that impede being virtuous or doing the right thing. We will never behave viciously if we are, and viciously means directed by vice instead of virtue. Um, we tend to use that word viciously to just mean aggressive and mean, but really that word viciously means of or relating to vice. And so from vice as opposed to virtue, the virtuous person has a good character, meaning they will behave that way all the time without exception, unless they're impeded by something that stops them, physically stops them from being virtuous. And at this point, I would point out perhaps these circumstantial variations are the thing that interfere with the uh, consistent character. You might think that somebody has a good character and would behave properly all the time, but it's just all these circumstances popping up that mean that we are totally unpredictable and inconsistent in our good behavior. That seems like it would be a problem for Aristotle in a practical sense, even if in a theoretical sense it does get rid of some of the difficulty posed by the empirical evidence. Um, and then this stuff about Jonathan McDowell, and this is he's one of the major neo-Aristotelians, which is why Doris refers to McDowell a couple of times here. And virtues issues nothing but right conduct, right, right, right. In sum, we can say, and this is the view, that Aristotelian virtues are robust or substantially resistant to contrary situational pressures in their behavioral manifestations. In other words, the thing I suggested, Doris doesn't think that that's right. That if we have virtues or a virtuous character, that the virtuous character in being virtuous is resistant to contrary situational pressures. That I'm going to be consistent. That Aristotelians tend to. Oh, well, this is getting onto another thing, but we're going to behave the same way all the time, even though there are contrary situational pressures to maybe encourage me not to do the right thing. Aristotelians also tend to maintain a version of evaluative consistency thesis, meaning that a given personality, the occurrence of a trait with a particular evaluative valence is probabilistically related to the occurrence of other traits with similar evaluative valences. That is a mouthful, and I have the shortened version in our notes for this month, and the short version is something like if you have some good traits, you're probably going to have other good traits, according to Aristotelians. Like if you're a truth teller, you're probably also not going to thieve and steal things. And if you're a non-murderer, if you help people, you're probably also going to say nice things to people. If you are bold in the right circumstances and but not to the point of foolhardiness, then you might also be a truth teller. And so the expectation is that somebody who is generous is more likely to be compassionate than callous. Like you're more likely to have other good traits. So good character is supposed to be an integrated association, integrated meaning they fit together in terms of a whole character. It's not just random good traits that are unconnected. So what would count as evidence? And this is a major point in the argument. If what Doris is doing is trying to prove that there's at least doubt that one can be good on the Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian take on things, then what we need, he says, and he's setting his own standard of evidence, so there might be an objection somewhere in here, but I don't have it in mind. The idea would be that we would have to have evidence that we would be able to observe behavioral reliability, consistent behavior, consistent with a group of related traits across a range of situations. So somebody's going to behave the same way that are all kind of grouped together and integrated traits or suggestive of an integrated group of traits across situations. And if notice that uh, what this standard of evidence means is that if we can find some counterexamples, it would be um, problematic for the view. If this is just an approach to argument, if you set up your opponent such that they're making a general claim, then all you need to do is provide some counterexamples to have that claim proved false, or at least put it in doubt. If I'm right about experimental data, systematic observation reveals failures of cross-situational consistency, behavior is surprisingly unreliable, despite what people think. So we have good reason to consider an alternative, and now we get to it. More empirically adequate conception of moral personality. So, like, what do people actually do? Situationist social psychology suggests an alternative. Its three central theses are that behavioral variation across a population owes more to situational differences than dispositional differences. So, like, if you tend to like tell lies 10% of the time and I tell lies 80% of the time, that it's not about our dispositional difference. It might have to do with the fact that I'm in situations where lying is beneficial or is somehow incentivized, whereas you're not, where it doesn't benefit you to lie. And if it did, you'd probably lie 80% of the time too. Empirical evidence problematizes the attribution of robust traits. So the idea that um, we see in actual situations that people are not consistent, and we don't have what we would call what a Aristotelian would call traits. And there can be, it says, note that this is not to deny possibility of temporal stability in behavior. So I might do the same, I might not lie most of the time, but the situationist says there might be uh, substantially similar situations across time that would kind of trigger or put me in the right situation to do that thing most of the time. But just saying, oh, she tells the truth most of the time, therefore she has a good character, what the view does is point out there's a disconnect there. Perhaps that person is often in the same situation over and over again. We could recognize here that the one way of putting this is that there is a affirming the consequent fallacy at play if one says, if the argument is, if you have a good character, then you are likely to tell the truth most of the time. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So the fallacy of affirming the consequent as it applies here would look like this, and on display here is an error in reasoning, not good reasoning. Uh, if one has good character, one will tell the truth most of the time. One tells the truth most of the time, therefore, one must have a good character. Um, Premise one is that hypothetical. If one has a good character, one would tell the truth most of the time. Premise two is an affirmation of the consequent of that hypothetical, that one tells the truth most of the time. It doesn't follow that one has a good character from that. Just as it doesn't follow from, if you run out of gas, your car will stop. Your car has stopped, therefore you have run out of gas. Doesn't make any sense. That's kind of a more obvious um, example of why affirming the consequent doesn't work. There could be lots of other things that cause my car to come to a stop. Maybe I pressed the brake pedal. In the case of truth telling over a period of time, we might say, yeah, maybe the circumstances suggested or encouraged you to tell the truth. And there could be a lot of other explanations at play as well. All that matters here is it is not obvious that it's your character or disposition that would have you tell the truth over time. Third thing, personality structure. And again, we're talking about the situationism's theses that have to do with behavioral variation that suggest an alternative to the Aristotelian account of moral personality. Number three here is personality structure is not typically evaluatively consistent. We have inconsistent dispositions that cohabitate in a single personality. So it is not the case that just because somebody is a truth teller that they would also not be a thief, or I mean that we are not consistent across all of these different descriptors of what a good character would be. The situationist, and now this is, again, we're still talking about this social psychology version of the view of how people are, called situationism. The situationist conception of personality is not an unrepentant skepticism about personological determinants of behavior. So, like, it's not like you have no determinants of your behavior that come from you, and then, like, it's all your surroundings. But the situationist does reject the notion of robust traits affecting cross situationally consistent behavior. So it's like Yeah, you might have some things in you that affect how you behave in response to outside stimuli, but the outside stimuli is important. It's not all you, it's not all your dispositional traits. And that maybe we should doubt that you have dispositional traits, at least more for moral evaluative purposes at all. The difficulty for the Aristotelian is that local traits are not likely to produce patterns of behavior expected across categories like compassionate or courageous. So we don't have these patterns across these situations. And then here I definitely highlighted too much, but I thought it was important to think about this. So let's just read together. Even if I'm on track so far, characterological discourse, like discourse about character or discourse that takes character as central, may yet be thought to be ground general forms of ethical evaluation. So, like maybe something about character can still survive. First, characterological psychology may be central to the ethical evaluation of actions. Aristotle insists that for an action to be considered truly virtuous, it must be determined by the appropriately developed character of the agent, meaning for a thing to be truly good, it has to be because it can't be by accident. It has to be based on your appropriately developed character. Second, in a line derived from Hume, um, the what is he, Scottish philosopher, judgments of moral responsibility may be thought to presuppose character assessments because an agent may be thought fully morally responsible only for actions that are legitimate expressions of her character. And so the idea here is that perhaps there is something about moral responsibility that means we should take the idea of character seriously. Um, and yeah, so we're going to get more. If we're too radical about this, we're not just going to be talking about moral psychological assessment, but all moral judgments. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose all moral judgment entirely. And then he takes it one thing at a time here. First, the claim that an Aristotelian characterological approach is uniquely able to provide a rich account of responsibility is contentious, meaning like there are other options to describe responsibility that do not rely on character, as was suggested above. Second, skepticism about Aristotelian notions of character doesn't commit one to be an implausibly empiricist, non psychologic account of responsibility and action assessment. There is room for psychological notions like intention and motivation. So it does permit for real psychological states. It's not just the outside world commanding us to act all the time. I think that has been drawn out and made clear here a couple of times. Character and deliberation. If I'm right, and maybe he's not, there's room to argue here. Situationism suggests a certain redirection of our ethical attention. So our like, what are we paying attention to when we're making judgments about what is true and what is good and what is bad behavior and what we ought to do and can do, and importantly, that can do is that's critical here. We should invest more of our energies in attending to the features of our environment that impact behavioral outcomes. So really talking like a behaviorist in this sense that our environment has an impact, our external stimuli impact our behavioral outcomes. Like we're going to do what our environment tells us to do in many cases, or at least be affected strongly by it. And reflection on situationism has an obvious benefit. It may serve to remind us that for people like us, the world is a morally dangerous place. Like, if we just walk around the world thinking, I'm developing a good character, I'm sure that what I'm doing is fine, we're actually going to be confusing ourselves and tricking ourselves into not being aware of the sorts of things that could cause us to deviate from our moral commitments. That we actually have there's actually moral danger in the world around us that we need to be prepared for, and we want to set us up for success and not for moral failure. And you should read the stuff about Milgram, the consequence of discrepancy between perception and reality, perception being what we would expect of ourselves and our moral commitments and the impact of our moral commitments on what we actually do, and reality, meaning what we actually do. There's a discrepancy there, and the consequence of the discrepancy is an increased probability of moral failure. If we ignore the fact that our surroundings really do play an impact on our behavior, we're going to screw up more times than we would hope. Our confidence in character is what puts us at risk in morally dangerous situations. And this is interesting. But instead of being indispensable, characterological discourse, talking about ourselves as having a good character or bad character, is heuristic or a shortcut, mental shortcut or reasoning shortcut that we may often have very good reason to dispense with. We should probably just get rid of that. If you take lessons to situationism to heart, you avoid dinner. So I guess I have to go back. You have a dinner of that is sumptuous food and fine wine, and your spouse is out of town, you probably should take situationism to heart and avoid dinner like the plague. You probably value fidelity, but maybe once you get in that situation, it's going to be harder to do the right thing than if you don't put yourself in that situation. I personally, rather than thinking about that, I don't love that example, and I think about it in these terms. If what I have am trying to avoid is like eating unhealthy foods, I'm not going to pack my refrigerator with unhealthy foods because my decision making is affected by the fact that when I open the refrigerator and it seems so easy to eat those unhealthy foods, well, it's much better and morally safer for me to put what I'm trying to avoid out of reach, physically out of reach, set myself up for success. And that is what the situationist wants me to do. At the same time, we should seek near occasions for happier behaviors, situations conducive to ethically desirable conduct. So, like, yeah, I'm going to avoid the bad stuff and set myself up for the good stuff. This means the determinants of moral success or failure may emerge earlier in an activity than we may think. So, like, if my goal is to exercise in the morning, the first step to exercising in the morning is to set the alarm at the right time. I mean, that's what they mean by, or what he means by earlier in an activity. Um, Further, many morally dangerous features of situations will have a degree of subtlety that make them difficult to unmask. So it's going to be really tricky. We're not going to get it right all the time, but we have to be at least attempting to recognize the impact of our situations on our choices. And the whole thing about setting ourselves up for success means we have to be very careful. It can, I submit, focus on, yeah, my approach cannot offer guarantees. It can focus our ethical attention where it may do the most good. Deliberation contexts where reflection on our values may be most likely to make a difference. So we should be thinking in terms of where can I really make a difference and to help me, future me, do the right thing. And I hope that the description here was helpful. I'd love to get questions or feedback. Feel free to take the quiz after you have watched this video and reviewed the paper and checked on your notes. And I'm going to pause and then come back with the other reading. Okay, so we're back, and quickly looking at the Jennifer Wimberly paper here. And this, rather than arguing against virtue ethics, we're looking at a paper that uses virtue ethics as a point of view to give basically a theoretical underpinning for why doctors have a moral obligation to overcome disparities and to change the disparities faced by transgender people. And that there is a call to action for doctors to actively do what they can to change this. And the background here, and I've just summarized the paragraph, that there are health outcome disparities that are the result of both lack of access to care and knowledgeable practitioners, as well as this other environment that is like everything from insurance coverage to social expectation and binary normativity that presents challenges for transgender individuals. And the call here is for virtue ethics as a way of dealing with the intersectionality. That means the coming together of environmental structures for the promotion of the good of the patient. Well, so to work against those negative structures and those negative environments and unhelpful environments, and instead to work toward the good of the patient as per, meaning like if the purpose of, or the telos means end, aim, or purpose. And based on the telos of medicine, which is to be a good version of a doctor that does good work and helps people, there is a requirement that is consistent with happiness as determined by Aristotle or decided or explained by Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics. And we have talked about Nicomachean Ethics with less emphasis on eudaimonia as happiness as important, but it is an important aspect of the Nicomachean Ethics. And we're going to go to the second page here. Further, I propose that ascribing to improving the care of individual transgender patients involves a call to action to overcome social, the ecology is our whole environment that affects what we do. So overcoming those spheres of influence that are affecting both the individual and the population of transgender individuals as a whole. So it affects not only the circumstances in which the doctor is acting, it will affect the well-being not only of the transgender person that the doctor is treating or refusing to treat, but transgender individuals everywhere, the population as a whole. And there is a call this is a call to public policy engagement. So this is something that we have, the public policy aspect of this is that it is for the good of society as a whole, and we're going to get there by way of the individual. And this idea of phronesis or practical wisdom, the capacity to reason, to attain the right end at the right time, to reach the mean, the middle ground between extremes, and practical wisdom specifically with regard to treating people, whatever that means in a particular case. If phronesis is practical wisdom to do the right thing at the right time, then we've got to figure out what the right thing at the right time is. Virtue being the basis of human dignity is a key idea here and a premise of this argument. And then there's this question. I think these papers do tend to kind of like jump forward in what feels like a really quick way, but that does make them easier to summarize, I suppose, if the argument might be harder to track. But the idea that virtue can or cannot be taught has been a it's been a point of contention or discussion that we haven't really addressed in our class, but there is this question: if virtue means having the right disposition to do the right thing at the right time, then can you teach that to someone? And Aristotle's answer and Neo-Aristotelian's answer is yes, we can be habituated into doing the right thing, to see things or perceive things in the right way. And here again, I'm just summarizing: to hold the virtue is that virtue is a constant habitual disposition to reason to choose the right action. That actually inserts the idea of reasoning toward the right action, which is a little bit different than the Neo-Aristotelian view, but we're going to accept it. And Shelton, apparently, the person that that our author is talking about, is the person who holds that virtue's constant habitual disposition to reason to choose the right action rather than just choosing the right action. There's that reasoning thing. So we're gonna roll with it. This involves a call to developing the habits based upon modeling teachers in the profession. So, like Aristotle says, you've got to look to, if you want to know what the right thing to do is, look at the virtuous person, do what that person does. Well, if we were to apply that here to the medical context, we would say, like, look to the best in that field, look to the people who are doing the right thing and who set a good example that we can follow. And then we will, let's see, Sheldon holds that the profession of medicine calls for certain behaviors and dispositions and looks to educators to do that. That would be the job of the trainer, the medical teacher in the medical field, to have good character and to do the right thing and have phronesis, that technical knowledge, and then transfer that or make that available, but not only just by telling you about it, but by exemplifying it in the way that they discuss. And what makes a doctor a good doctor? And there's all this talk about a good doctor. Well, the telos, or end, aim, or purpose of being a doctor, is what gives us an evaluative criteria for being a good doctor or not being a good doctor. And I will put something in the notes here about telos and phronesis. I'll add that so that by the time you see it, it should be there. And we're just going to pause right here. Right. So the next thing is conscientious objection. And the view that the the most important thing in medicine is to preserve and respect human dignity. That's the end of medicine, the goal of medicine. And here's the view from Pellegrino that there can be a doctor who is a what is called a conscientious objector, meaning if you have some moral objection to something that you refuse to participate. And Shelton and Pellegrino's conditions taken together, and there is a 1 + 1 = 2 kind of argument that unfolds here that you might summarize and reject if you're looking for something to respond to. Shelton and Pellegrino's taken together suggests that the physician has to honor the dignity of the patient by either provide care or, in times of moral opposition, to provide a resource for the patient to pursue the good by another provider. And this idea that we live in a multicultural and pluralistic meaning multiple competing views of the good society in which physicians practice medicine, suggests that the physician is in a position to maintain a degree of knowledge of possible resources. So if you're a doctor and you don't want to assist a patient in transitioning, then you do have a responsibility to provide resources, to know about resources, and to provide them. That is part of part of the claim here. And there are lots of barriers, of course, that combine to make transitioning difficult. Mere existing for transgender individuals to be difficult, and then we're going to get the response here in a moment. So Pellegrino calls for the respect of humanity of the patient and the need to allow the patient to make their own choices. The idea of looking at disagreements between what the doctor thinks or believes and the desire of the patient should is something that is applied or considered with regard to gender. And then think about the circumstance that we might imagine a circumstance in which uh, transgender person has trouble gaining access to healthcare after surmounting the barriers to care and encountering a provider who not only lacks the knowledge to provide compassionate care, but also claims an inability to treat the individual based on the provider's moral agency and belief. Basic health needs cannot refuse to be met by providers. So if we're a good doctor and the telos of a good doctor is to treat and care for the patient until they are better, then we cannot just say, I don't like you, I won't treat you. We have a duty to non-abandonment. And then here's another example. The For the individual, the basic health needs of the infection of a liver or kidney infection for a gender affirming individual do not involve being other than an individual with an infection. You are just a person with an infection. The presence of identifying as a trans individual does not alter the relationship of the healer to one being healed. Such an individual should be met with technical skill as any other patient, and the character of the good doctor would not permit a refusal on the individual's health needs as other than what the virtuous physician treats. So, if what you treat is kidney infections and a trans individual comes to you and says, I have a kidney infection, you can't say, oh, I don't know anything about trans treatments. I don't agree with your being a trans person. And so I refuse to treat you. Um, the obligation to abandon a treatment, not to abandon a patient, means that the physician can't abandon somebody who needs treatment that is uh, typical of any patient. Let's read this part. The physician need not compromise one's moral agency to act in accord with a compromise or concession of the other's values, but must recognize the good as the patient defines it is of value to the patient, must be recognized in congruence with the telos of medicine. So, what the patient thinks is good should matter to the doctor. The telos of medicine is the restoration of health and the good of the patient. And there is a narrative contained within that that an objective based on gender identity of the patient isn't congruent with the promotion of the professional as healer, nor the profession of one who heals. Knowledge of the transgender vocab, awareness of multiple contexts, disparities that arise and propagate, including microaggressions perceived by the provider's lack of knowledge, must be part of the work in action that is the character of the good doctor. So, part of your job as a good doctor is, look, you might refuse to compromise to provide care to transgender individuals on the basis of an objection to the conscience or moral agency, but your professional nature, being a good doctor, does not permit a refusal to learn. The physician must not refuse to learn, to acknowledge the vocabulary and the historical and social context by which transgender individuals face barriers to healthcare. You've got to know about the barriers. You cannot refuse to learn about the barriers that people experience. And once you know that, it may change the way you see your obligation. And coming up on the end here, the uh, the good doctor will honor moral values by learning what barriers the patient faces. If you intend to be a good doctor who is compassionate and cares about the good of the patient, including the good of the patient as the patient understands it, then you have an obligation to provide resources. If you're not going to provide treatment, you'd better be able to provide resources that will help the person get treatment. The doctor shall not simply state, I will not treat you, but rather, I have available resources that you may pursue to assist you in treatment. And not just a pro forma, like, oh, yeah, here are some papers that somebody might be able to help you, but it's not going to be me. Instead, you have to have a genuine, compassionate approach to the person and offer actually helpful resources. It is acknowledgement of the person's patient's ideal of the good for themselves and a recognition of a biomedical good that the physician is unable to provide. If you're not able to help, you better find somebody who is. Conclusion: the care of the transgender individual is contextually complicated. That's the intersectionality by societal and institutional barriers. And one of the barriers is the normative kind of assumption about binary gender, and then there are all tremendous other stigmatizing experiences, housing hardships. I mean, this is part of the point of the paper, that there are all these things acting together. The physician's aspect is, look, we can't have another relational aggression based on something that the doctor is committed to. We don't want them to refuse to learn to be able to treat a significant portion of the population. And here's another too much highlighting that I did. In this paper, I've intended to evoke a knowledge of terminology as well as of disparities in healthcare outcomes. And we want the virtuous physician to choose knowingly to overcome obstacles. Knowledge develops the skill set which provides comfort and care to fulfill the covenant for the attainment of the good of the patient as they define it according to their life values and goals. Such judgment, or practical wisdom, or phronesis, is a virtue in action that shall improve the health of transgender individuals, which will improve everybody. It's good for everybody if we improve the health of individuals. And so that was just this paper, this second paper that we were required to read. And I hope that my walkthrough was helpful on both accounts. And we want to see you get to those assignments. Please drop me a line if you have any doubts or confusions or concerns, and I would love to be of assistance to you. We can also plan to have a meeting at some point this week. Just drop me a line if you want to do any one-on-one coaching. Happy to help.